Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Christina Heatherton. I'm delighted to be here today with my colleague and friend, Isaac Kamola. Isaac is an associate professor of political science at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He's also the co-founder of Trinity's chapter of the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. Isaac is the author of multiple works, including Making the World Global, U.S. Universities and the Production of the Global Imaginary. He's the co-editor of both the Politics of African Anti-Colonial Archive and the Transnational Politics of Higher Education. Recently, with Ralph Wilson, he published Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War. Isaac's work challenges the vision of colleges as lofty ivory towers where isolated academics reflect upon the real world but are not actually a part of it. Instead, Isaac shows that the academy has always been a critical place from which the world has been imagined, reshaped, and also reproduced. His scholarship describes ongoing political struggles to define what the world is. His public writing and organizing invite us to also imagine what the world could be. So thanks so much for joining us, Isaac.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Great. Okay, well, let's start in the present moment. These are dangerous times for educators. Panics over critical race theory, queer theory, feminism, trans rights, and histories of structural violence dominate the news. A slew of new laws seek to limit what can be taught, read, or even discussed in classrooms. Groups like Campus Reform say they're opposing the woke mob, and pundits like Charlie Kirk, Chris Rufo, and Candace Owens all say they're defending free speech. While this all seems like a popular revolt, you and your co-author Ralph Wilson describe it instead as a manufactured culture war. Your new book, Free Speech and Koch Money, traces its origins to a, quote, small handful of plutocratic libertarian donors who seek to remake the world for their own benefit. So can you explain this argument? What is this network of donors and why have they made higher education a battleground?
Absolutely, thanks. That's a great question. I think that there's a lot of coverage about attacks on school boards, about different instances of a Milo Yiannopoulos coming to Berkeley or Charles Murray coming to Middlebury, and this protest and this outrage about free speech. And those events oftentimes are reported on as kind of isolated events or kind of a particular phenomenon from a particular time. But our book, Ralph and my book, we develop analysis that kind of gives the broader context to put these isolated examples into. And that broader context draws on the primary sources of those who were responsible and are responsible for having constructed what we call the Koch donor network and the various organizations that network funds. And in order to do that, you can look back at, and we look back in the book, at 1970s, Charles Koch expressing these ideas in the context of desegregation and in the context of the struggles in the 70s, the attack on the legacy of the New Deal, the desire for corporate capital to lower taxes, to deregulate the economy. Looked increasingly towards Austrian economics in order to legitimize a political project. In the 1970s, he funded a bunch of small think tanks and literary groups to study and advocate for a certain, what Nancy MacLean calls a property supremacist vision of libertarianism. And then in 1980, his brother David ran for vice president on the Libertarian ticket and got a very small percentage of the vote, despite having spent millions of dollars on that campaign, kind of an unprecedented amount for a third party. So that led to a rethinking among Charles Koch and his plutocratic libertarian allies that one couldn't change policy and therefore change the world by simply lobbying politicians or running for office. Instead, they realized that you had to think about social change at an industrial scale, right? So instead of thinking about the production of a widget, right, you can think of the production of social change, and they applied a model of production to social change. And so they drew upon the work of this guy, Richard Fink, who is an economist at Rutgers and would go on to hold high places at the Charles Koch Foundation and Koch Industries. It's kind of widely understood as Koch's kind of personal strategist who developed this model of social change at an industrial scale, where you start with the raw materials, and those raw materials are the legitimizing ideas. So, that takes place in the academy. So the production of anarcho-capitalist theories, legal theories, philosophical theories, revisionist histories that kind of are treated and presented as academic work. And that work then gets linked to the think tanks where that work is refined. This is the language that they use, right? That the raw material of academic ideas are refined in the think tanks where they're turned into a set of policy proposals. Those policy proposals are then handed to a series of activists who then advocate for those and create the semblance of grassroots uprising and support, writing letters, protesting and things like that. These are groups like Freedom Works, Americans for Prosperity. And then at that point, once you've created this semblance of an intellectually legitimate set of policy proposals that have mass support, then you approach the legislators and push for the change to policy, right? And this is the same strategy that's behind, for example, Citizens United. If you look at Citizens United, the Supreme Court justices that heard that case were selected by the Federalist Societies. The vast majority of amicus briefs were written by groups that were funded by the Koch donor network. The plaintiffs themselves were a production company that was funded by Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer, who are and Robert Mercer being a regular attendant of Koch summits. And so you have this kind of very small group of organizations that appear to be kind of widely representative, but are actually just a crystallization of very wealthy corporate interests that work together in an integrated fashion in order to push the desired policy proposals. So the thing that was really helpful for us in kind of understanding not just isolated incidents like a Supreme Court case or attack on labor rights or stand your ground bills, and understanding this kind of crazy policy transformations that have happened in the last 2 decades that have been radically individualizing, radically antisocial, right? Have no conception of the social, or just like make Ronald Reagan seem like a naive little 9-year-old compared to the kind of ferocity of that kind of individualist, property supremacist ideology that is now the guiding ideology on the Supreme Court and the federal judge, so basically, kind of instead of looking at particular instances and dissecting those, we think that it's helpful to have that structure of social change as a way of understanding kind of how this broad network works together. And then when you do that, you realize that higher education is actually where the whole strategy begins. And therefore, gaining greater donor access to higher education is really important. And this is something that Charles Koch was very clear about as far back as the 70s, where he was saying, it's one thing to give money to a college and university, but then they can go on and do with that money what they will. If you give it to the endowment, for example, right? They could use it to hire, black sociologists, right? Or to hire all feminist theorists, queer theorists, right? But if you set up that funding to be donor driven, right, where the donor has considerable control over how that money is spent, so you could set up your own academic centers, you could fund your own law schools and public policy programs, your standalone institutes that all have this legitimacy of being like academic institutions but are deeply funded. So there's lots of evidence, for example, of Charles Koch Foundation contracts that built into them, they have named individuals, right? We'll give you this millions of dollars if you hire this person and allow them to hire the other people in that academic center, right? Because the end goal is the production of certain kinds of ideas that fit into this broader political structure.
Right. That's fantastic. And I want to drill down on this question about why higher education, because there's a lot of different ways we can think about this, lobbying groups, the Federalist Society, but your book on the Koch network thinks about higher education. So let me phrase this question to you this way. There's been this really interesting debate about the value of education with the whole student debt crisis. Many conservatives are decrying the uselessness of a college degree. They depict college professors as these pretentious, out of touch, overpaid people, even though, as we know, over 75% of the profession is casualized contingent labor. Efforts to slash education funding and stop the forgiveness of student debt are really fueled by these characterizations. So while higher education is being depicted as this bad investment, as you say, far-right forces understand its extraordinary value. So you describe how the Koch network is invested in academia as a strategic beachhead for training experts, legitimating worldviews, and recruiting students, among other functions. So can you say a little bit more about how the far-right is specifically infiltrating the academy? What value does the Koch network see in the production of knowledge and the development of its own intellectuals? And also, what might we learn from this perspective?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think it's not unfair to basically to say that there is a massive welfare state that exists for libertarian, pro-corporate, pro-capitalist, pro-free trade academics, right? So, for example, the Institute for Humane Studies, this massively Koch-funded center at George Mason University, if you can go to a website and enter 300-word essays and potentially receive $40,000 in sabbatical funding, right? So if you're part of this network, there's an incredible amount of resources that are available. And so the result is that a lot of ideas that wouldn't otherwise meet that are outside of where the academy is, right? And I think this is an important, and then this goes back to that issue of free speech, where the reason why the language of free speech is so important to the libertarian right, is because the university and the process of academic peer review, academic freedom, scholarly research, and disciplined teaching is based on a notion that universities are where ideas are vetted, right? That not all ideas are equal, right? That the role of scholarship and of faculty and of students inquiring primary sources and making arguments and debating is to exclude certain ideas from consideration, right? And so when you have funders that are in the extractive resources, that are oil barons, right? It's not surprising that they are upset that academics in the environmental sciences are producing knowledge, scientific, peer-reviewed knowledge that demonstrates that climate change is man-made, right? So their strategy has been to basically set up another side of the argument, right? And basically say, well, we're hearing a lot from these climate scientists, but we're not hearing from those climate scientists that say that climate change is not man-made. So they create their own Heartland Institute. They pack it with kind of corporate friendly scientists to produce a bunch of research that proves the other side of the story. And then they use free speech to basically say, hey, you have your side of the story. We have our side of the story. You need to listen to both of these and take them as seriously. This is actually the strategy that was developed by the Koch network in the 1970s to push back against tobacco regulation, right? They were saying, oh, you have all of these people, all these scientists saying that smoking causes cancer, but you're not hearing from those who enjoy smoking, who are the smokers group. So what we have to do is listen to the smokers and evaluate these two perspectives against each other and say, you both have free speech, right? Lewis Powell would actually make the argument that the FEC should give equal hearing time to both the scientists and the advocates of smokers using a free speech argument, right? So you see the strategy cut and pasted over and over and over and over again, right? Where you manufacture the other side of the story, right? Professors are these radicals who are out of touch. A professor saying, we are scholarly, we produce this knowledge, we are trained, we're professionals. And then the other side of the story being like, they're violating free speech, they're ideologues trying to indoctrinate. And then they push it up there as saying, these two things are equally valid. Well, the limit of that strategy, however, is that if you have credible experts in the academy that are given a disproportionate amount of, or an appropriate amount of respect, right? Mm-hmm. Because of their expertise, their position, their specialization, right? And then you have a bunch of think tank hacks saying, they're wrong, right? That doesn't have the same kind of balance, right? So in order to kind of undermine the legitimacy of the university, you have to create your kind of parallel university, right? That is producing arguments that are otherwise largely discredited within the mainstream academic discipline. So libertarianism is fundamentally an asocial argument, right? We are all individuals existing in a rational market, participating in self-maximization. There is no social, right? But we know that the last decades of social theory, social sciences, and humanities have demonstrated through a number of profound theoretical developments and transformations in our thinking that we are, from everything from gender, race, the language that we use, affect, all kinds of things, socially constructed beings, right? And so that poses this existential threat to a libertarian ideology, and has largely said that notion of rational human beings that are self-utility maximized, that's like an outdated, antiquated set of arguments that can no longer stand up against the robust, vetted, well-argued, rigorously researched body of work that proves exactly the opposite, right? So, but yet the donors need this kind of ideological argument, right, in order to justify the obscene amounts of wealth that they've gathered. Well, you can't get those kinds of arguments within the academy, right? And so you create a parallel academy. And then when people in the actual academy criticize those at these centers and pay-to-play programs, then they decry, oh, you know, you're violating our free speech, right? You are not allowing viewpoint diversity on campus, right? And so they basically use these arguments to say, these arguments that are otherwise not legitimate by the parameters of the institution and the project of academic and scholarly research should still be taken as seriously as if they were, and using that language of free speech as a way to justify that these two things should be treated equally.
Both sides. Very good people on both sides,
exactly.
Right? I wonder actually if you could say a little bit more about how that works with critical race theory and pundits like Chris Rufo, who appear to be doing just that.
Yeah, so that's a great example, because we started this book kind of in what now appears to be kind of the tapering off of the particular strategy that kind of hit its peak in 2017, right? So in 2017, there was this 2016, 2017, 2018, there's this really long, very high profile instances of very explicitly provocative, paid provocateurs that are coming to campus, that were invited to campus, and that they cause all kinds of commotions, like the most notoriously being Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley, Charles Murray at Middlebury, Ben Shapiro at a bunch of places, at Candace Owens. And so in our book, what we demonstrate is that like the entire careers and platforming of these particular cadre of provocative speakers their careers are made possible by the Koch donor network, whether that be Milo Yiannopoulos at Breitbart and others of these personalities that are kind of brought up within this network. Then on top of that, you have student groups that have access to external pipelines of money that then invite these provocative students, and because they have that access to both the funds and the legal pressure to demand that their institutions allow these speakers on campus, are able to create this controversy in the first place. And then if there's a protest, or even if there's not, there's then a series of news articles about how outrageous it was that this, totally decent person was treated in such a way, and it's so outrageous. Oh my God, can you believe this? This is so terrible. And that network, those stories start out in this right-wing media ecosystem that's funded by the same set of funders. And then on top of that, you have a series of litigation groups that then pressure schools and threaten to sue them if they don't allow this kind of speech on campus, right? And use their considerable organized political and legal infrastructure to put pressures on schools to allow these speakers who have no interest in an academic debate, no interest in engaging the ideas, and are there to be provocateurs and political recruiters, right? Are the legal groups kind of put pressure on schools. And then on top of that, you have a series of other groups that are organized to pass legislation, like we saw in 2017, 18, and 19, a series of campus free speech bills that basically made it criminal to protest speakers and and whatnot on college campuses. So again, making it easier for certain provocative speakers to have a foothold on college campuses. So in the book, we call this kind of integrated strategy that appears to be totally organic, but if you look at who's funding the organization, part of this broader, organizations funded by the Koch donor network. And so that was kind of like the hot ticket and the winning strategy for a while. And then I think schools started to get a little bit smarter, a little bit, it stopped having, and it also stopped having the cachet that it used to have, this kind of a strategy that's still ongoing. It still like throws numerous schools into kind of disarray when a student brings one of these provocateurs to campus. It can be very destabilizing. When Trinity brought Candace Owens to campus, it was a really, it was Trinity students with access to outside funding brought Candace Owens to campus. And then there was a bunch of really terrible, hateful stuff that was said at that talk. And students that I work with had to see their peers like stand up and cheer these like really hateful things that were said, and then had to go back to the dorms and go to the cafeteria, now knowing what these students support a win there in the presence of somebody who specializes in stoking this kind of outrage, is not interested in engaging ideas or debating or having some sort of scholarly, well-researched argument, but is instead there to provoke. So anyway, so our book kind of looks at that phenomenon, right? But in recent years, it's very quickly, I think especially after Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, has turned towards this language of critical race theory, right? And again, that seemed to come out of the blue, right? Oh my gosh, everybody's talking about critical race theory. What is going on? Now there's these parents that are protesting in school board meetings. Well, what's going on? There must be a bunch of people who are outraged about a critical race theory. But if you take kind of the broader structure that we examine in our book, and you move it from the campus free speech crisis, and you look at the critical race theory moral panic, you see exactly the same players. So in the case of critical race theory, it's Chris Rufo, who you probably know, and the listeners probably know, is a creature of the Manhattan Institute and other right-wing think tanks, funded by incredible amounts of Koch and other money from other libertarian and plutocratic fellow travelers. It's a whole kind of ecosystem. If you go to Heritage, American Enterprise, Manhattan Institute, there's whole websites specializing in reports and people whose now careers is to like gin up this kind of evidence that critical race theory is this terrible thing that's destroying all of humanity. It's just like these reports are really bad. I mean, they're really like nonsensical and clearly like written by people who've never actually engaged the arguments, right? In a sincere way or in a sincere, critical way. So now groups like Freedom Works, which is a Koch kind of GOTV citizen outreach group, is created a kind of standalone branded BEST group that brings and does a bunch of trainings for us parents. A lot of times it's like the same parents going to many different school board meetings. Sometimes it's staffers going to school board meetings saying that they're other parents. But there's these groups and a bunch of other similar groups funded by different aspects that are received different kinds of funding and are integrated within the broader political network that are kind of creating the semblance of mass outrage, that are mass producing that kind of other side of the story, right? That itself is kind of the result of material that's been inherited or produced first by academics providing the general critique of critical race theory from the libertarian right-wing perspective. And then that goes to organizations like the Heritage. You write these absurd journals or reports about critical race theory that then get funded down into these activist groups. And then now you have the bills that are being passed also by groups that oftentimes have close affiliations with Koch donor network.
Right. So it's a difficult time to do research.
Yeah.
So I actually have a question about you and your own research and your research methods, because I think there's a really interesting way that you research the Koch network, and also that you research other intellectuals and other forms of knowledge production. So your first book, Making the World Global, questions the self-evident way in which the world has been imagined from the point of view of higher education. And you consider the efforts of business school, government agencies, international finance institutions, and philanthropies to produce common sense ideas of the world, globalization, international development. And in that book, you do your method, I think, is really interesting, of putting different figures in their conjuncture, showing how they shape them. You know, figures like Robert McNamara of the World Bank, or Theodore Levitt, professor of the Harvard Business School, or NYU President John Sexton. So I wonder if we could talk about research. Can you talk to me a little bit about your method? How do you analyze these figures in their conjunctures, and why do you think this is a useful way to trace the production of knowledge?
Sure. I think it's, there's a kind of a truism that we only have one really big idea. And I think that my really big idea came in grad school when I was kind of flailing around for a dissertation topic. At the same time, there was really impressive organizing that was being done by the clerical workers, the AFSCME Clerical Union 3800. Really incredible organizers that were really articulating both the institution of the university, what it was doing to them, what it could possibly be if not trying to become one of the top 3 research universities in the world, and all of the neoliberal changes that were necessary in order to make that happen, right? They were pushing back on that in a really organized and brilliant way. And at the same time, as I'm flailing around, so I'm going to picket lines and organizing with them. And then at the same time, I'm trying to figure out a dissertation topic. And I end up on this topic of globalization, and because in a way there's money there, right? I was thinking, how am I going to get a job? There's no jobs out there. What can my former topic, I'm not sure that I would be competitive for a job studying that. So what could I possibly do that would make sure that I could pay the bills and have a livelihood in the future? Everybody seems to be talking about globalization. There's a lot of money for graduate students to research globalization. There was all this stuff. This was kind of in the mid 2000s, right? And so one day I just kind of realized that these two things were exactly the same, right? That me trying to decide what a dissertation topic was exactly the same, or took place within the same context, the same conjuncture, the same structural forces that were making sure that clerical workers were not getting paid well, that first generation students of color, poor students were increasingly being excluded from the University of Minnesota because they didn't have high enough test scores, things like that. These were the same forces, right? And that what was a material struggle over here was a question over here of research design. What is my topic of my dissertation, right? And I began to realize that if you put these two things together, and you take the brilliant insights that the AFSCME clerical workers have about what the university is and how it's structured, and you use that as a lens to understand the process of writing a dissertation, then there's actually just a lot that can be learned, right? And so the book was an effort or the dissertation, which is kind of a hot mess, but the book, which I'm much more proud of, was an effort to kind of think through that, and through kind of a symptomatic reading was the project that was in the dissertation, kind of seeing what were the kind of underlying assumptions that were built into the concept of globalization, right? Mm-hmm. These borderless world, free transactions of goods and communication across time. Well, that sounds a lot like the academic career of an R1 professor, right, who travels to conferences and jet sets and has high-speed internet and does all of these things. And so it makes sense that somebody in an R1 institution pumping out articles and books about globalization is going to have certain assumptions about what globalization is. And then conversely, if certain people are actively excluded from the process of producing a knowledge because they got kicked out or they got pushed out of the university for economic reasons, or because they come from groups of people that are not well represented in the university, or for all kinds of mental health reasons. That means can't finish their degree, can't find a job, or working contingent, teaching 6 classes for no money and therefore not able to produce research, right? Those are all ideas and possible worlds and ways of knowing the world that are kind of pushed out of the university and pushed out of the body of academic knowledge, right? And so the book Making the World Global was kind of an effort to kind of examine kind of in a more rigorous way looking at how an individual produces knowledge within a particular conjuncture, right? And so how the World Bank, right, during the 1970s was the material conditions in which Robert McNamara could articulate a certain vision of development and a certain understanding of an integrated world, right? And how John Sexton at NYU offers, because of his position at a different particular conjuncture, articulates the university in these kinds of transcendent, kind of Christian, Jesuit, theological ways. And that both there's a lot of contingency. I hope that came across in the book, that there's a lot of contingency, that we're not just a product of the structures or the conjunctures that we're a part of, but those structures profoundly shape us. And this is just an insight that I get from, I guess, my own, I think is fairly idiosyncratic reading of Althusser, that there's this kind of observation that I made in reading Althusser, that his method is oftentimes to take an individual theorist and kind of place them and kind of look at their texts and the silences and the absences, and then tries to examine those through understanding the conjuncture of which they're part. So, for example, in Machiavelli and Us, just like my favorite essay, that question of why is it that this text continues, why does Machiavelli continue to capture the imagination, is read and people still can't make heads or tails of it, right? Well, it has everything to do with the fact that it was written as a particular political intervention at a particular moment in time, presented as a universal statement, right? A kind of a universal claim about what politics is that's actually presented as a universal in an abstract claim about politics, when in fact it's a very particular intervention at a very particular time and place, right? And so kind of that observation kind of makes it possible to think about, and it's true to, I think, my own experience, and I would assume most academics, right? That experience of like, oh, I have this idea in my head, but I need to get tenure. Okay, so how am I going to translate this idea that I really like into something that's going to be published in this journal so I can get that job, so these kinds of things can happen, right? And in a way, we are oftentimes very dishonest in terms of the kind of material conditions that structure the outcome, and the outcome is treated just as a kind of a distillation of our thought, as opposed to a kind of intervention into a particular conjuncture, where both the thinking, the academic work and research and reading and writing that goes into it is one part of it, but also that kind of like, how do we kind of navigate the particular conjunctures in which we find ourselves, and then also make interventions upon them, right? And that idea of and then kind of my own idiosyncratic reading of Althusser, I guess, is that if you take that argument, his argument about structure, and you kind of take it to its logical conclusion, then you get this story that's much more kind of contingent. I guess this is the late Althusser, I guess, but like much more contingent, right? Much more, where structure exists, and that the experience of being an individual, and in the case of the interest of my book, an individual engaged in producing knowledge about globalization, that process of thinking and the material conditions in which we find ourselves, that we can't actually make the distinction between those two, and at the same time that's a product not just of it's a product of a deep contradiction, where an analysis of capitalism has a particularly powerful role to kind of explain the final instance, which never comes, I guess.
Yeah. I think if we had an extra hour, I would just pepper you with a lot more questions about Althusser. But I want to talk about contradictions in higher education, because there's this amazing detail you offer about McNamara at the World Bank in the 60s and 70s, and the kind of unintended consequence of funding African universities and inadvertently making them vibrant centers of anti-colonial thought. So some of the great examples you describe are like the University of Nairobi in Kenya, where Ngugi wa Thiong'o and others organized, or the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where of course Walter Rodney, Mahmoud Mamdani, Giovanni Arrighi, and others produce a dynamic center of radical intellectual ferment. So of course from these places and from the broader struggles around them came what you and Shira El-Malik call a, quote, large and often forgotten body of work that formed the intellectual backbone of Africa's anti-colonial struggles. And this is what the two of you discuss in your co-edited book, Politics of African Anti-Colonial Archive. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about it. Why did you edit this book, and what alternative forms of world making emerge from the African Anti-Colonial Archive?
Great, that's a great question. And I mean, part of the answer is, of course, disciplinary. So, of course, therefore, conjunctural, right? Like navigating a particular discipline and set of conversations, and a kind of a discontent. Like I'm in a political science department and study international relations, and just kind of deeply concerned by the way in which a lot of the really brilliant work that's being done by scholars in the subfield of international relations is deeply parochial, where it talks about IR and obsesses about the problems of IR as if anybody outside the discipline cares about it, right? Which I know all disciplines have this kind of navel gazing, but I think it's particularly stark in my particular discipline. And so there's a tendency to kind of look at things like archives or work of African anti-colonial struggles and ask, how do they speak to IR? How do they speak to questions that are about international relations, and kind of, in a way, kind of capture those ideas for the purpose and bringing them. That's the language of how do you bring these ideas back into IR? And there's this weird, I think it's kind of a perversion where there's the discipline is dependent upon the vibrancy of ideas that are produced outside of our subfield, and then at the same time brings in all of these ideas and then produces knowledge that is not shareable, that is so parochial and so kind of self-obsessed, that it's hard to kind of for people to read it outside of our discipline. And I think that's really tragic. So the thing that I found in reading it, theorists who are working, and theorists and activists and leaders and who are writing and working and thinking in the context of African anti-colonialism, and this is true for lots of different struggles, but this is the one I'm just most familiar with, is that way in which the questions, the intellectual questions, were deeply tied to political questions, right? That there's no distinction between, and that there's actually considerable weight that depends upon how you answer certain questions, right? And so, concepts that, say, Fanon produces, right, come from an experience of struggle, come from these questions of how do we defeat colonialism, how do we destroy imperialism, how is it that we create a new world that is somewhat freer, that is somewhat more just? How do we build that? And okay, in order to do that, we need new kind of concepts and understandings that are both deeply informed by, a lot of the thinkers that I'm interested in spend a lot of time in Europe and the US, are deeply trained in canonical Western texts, and then are going back and are rereading them and rewriting them in just fantastically brilliant ways, driven by the question of how am I going to, help, my people become independent? How are we going to overthrow colonialism? And so that idea of both ideas really matter, right? There's a real stake in getting the argument right, and then to develop new concepts and new terms, kind of that could be useful as kind of political weapons and strategic interventions into a particular moment, right? And so ideas are very serious and important, but they're not written for that kind of academic disciplinary audience, right? So in a way, my question is, like, kind of the thing that I find most invigorating about reading African anti-colonial theory in the context of a neoliberal university, right, is that it helps me think about how can I understand the university as itself a kind of conjuncture that is engaged, needs to be engaged, and is producing knowledge of all kinds, including plutocratic libertarian ideas that justify excessive and obscene wealth, right? But also other kinds of knowledges, right? And so, kind of thinking about that, the way in which the body of work doesn't have to debate, doesn't have to wring its hands over, is there a distinction between thought and action? Is there what's the value of ideas versus practice? All of these kinds of ideas that academics get obsessed about, right? That those questions are not, you don't have to ask those, because there's a realization that, you come up with ideas and they'll be useful or not. And if they're useful, then we'll be reading about them decades later, right? And if they're not, then they got subsumed by the conjuncture, right? And so the process of examining African anti-colonial archives is that process of going back and both identifying kind of the context and the conjunctures within which certain texts that we know kind of came out of and continued to reverberate, but also all of the moments of struggle, contestation, and demands for a more just world that maybe we haven't heard of, or maybe are there's a brilliant piece in that collection by Alan Stack, who talks about Thomas Sankara, and the idea that under the Blaise Compaoré regime, you couldn't talk about Sankara, and so there you had this memory of Sankara that existed in these archives of newspaper articles and pamphlets and that were being kind of smuggled around, and yet when it came time to overthrow the Compaoré regime, Sankara was everywhere, right? That his face and his words and his speeches were everywhere. And so that idea that like the archive appeared not to be there, but was always there, and kind of existed in these ways that were ready to be kind of, part of a democratic excess that was already had that potential within it. So kind of looking at the politics of African anti-colonial archive is a way to kind of see what is it, especially, writing within a liberal arts school in Connecticut, right? I'm not like, there's to kind of think about like, how is it that one can approach the production of academic ideas, understanding the conjunctures of which we're from, right? Where we're working, and what is it in thinkers from this particular moment at this particular time that still resonate, right? I think it's a pretty important claim to say that this thought is not, particular to Africa, is not particular to the mid-20th century, but is instead like universalizable claims from within a particular conjuncture, right? That they can be useful for doing certain things within our particular moment.
Well, arguably, a liberal arts college in Hartford, Connecticut is pretty far from an anti-colonial struggle against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. And yet, you seem to have taken a lot of inspiration from a particular African anti-colonial thinker, I'm going to call Cabral, who was, of course, a theorist, an agronomist, and a leader in the struggle against Portuguese colonialism. So you have a wonderful piece where you engage particularly on this point you just made, where you use a concept called realism without abstraction. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why Cabral in particular is useful for your thinking, and what do you mean by realism without abstraction?
Yeah, absolutely. So, no, Cabral is somebody where I read his I have friends who were like, you have to read Cabral, and I read Cabral. I was like, I like, and then I kept reading it over and over again, and just kind of began to see a kind of just a beautiful argument, I think, and a beautiful set of claims that kind of took me a while to kind of see what was really at stake, and Cabral makes, of course, the famous claim that that you can't have a revolution without a proper theory, right? That theory is a weapon, right? That is necessary. That you can't wage a struggle for independence against colonialism without the proper theory. He also importantly says that just having the right theory is not enough.
That's right.
But and I think that's a really important part, right? So like all the academics who are concerned about making the most beautiful arguments because that will somehow lead to all of this amazing activism in the streets, right? He's saying that like that these two things are deeply connected, right? He's not saying, oh, we don't need theory, but he's also not saying that theory will save us, right? But it's not just that, that's a compelling observation, but I think it's how he arrives at that conclusion, right? And so this is kind of what I'm getting at with this idea of realism without abstraction. So first of all, like coming from a subfield that's obsessed with realism, there's that bit of that intervention into the discipline saying, wait a minute, we have all of this discussion about realism and international relations, but there's other ways of understanding realism. But the way in which Cabral, it comes from this really amazing essay where Cabral says, right, what does it mean to be a revolutionary? And in order to be a revolutionary, you have to be a realist. What does it mean to be a realist? And he starts by saying, here we are on this land, and he lays out the topography, he lays out the types of plants that live there, the kinds of the resources that and it kind of grows. And I think about it in terms of like concentric circles, right? He's starting out from this very like, what is the material physical world that's around me, and then what are the kind of, you know, the economic resources, and then the socialities and culture. He talks about the culture of Guinea-Bissau as being this reality, and then he spreads out thinking about that one of the realities that they're a part of is the reality of you know, other countries that are engaged in anti-colonial struggle, and then the reality of imperialism itself. So it's kind of these kind of concentric circles of forms of reality, right? And it's interesting. He doesn't go into a deep meditation about what reality is. He just asserts like, this is a reality, this is a reality, this is a reality. And then he has this explanation that all of these realities are informing each other, right? But not all of them are informing where we particularly stand at a given point equally or in the same way. And therefore, we need to understand the realities and all the different levels of realities, but be primarily concerned with the reality that concerns us most at a particular moment, right? And for me, I think that's helpful to kind of think, again, going back to Althusser and this language of conjuncture, right, is that one can have a complicated idea of structure. And that's oftentimes like the criticism levied against Althusser is this kind of like totalizing view of structure, this heavy weight of structure that's kind of like all determinate, and there's no room for agency, and, you know, that this kind of oppressive structural form. But that idea that Cabral says about like, no, we have to be aware of all of that, right? But also primarily engage that element which concerns us most. And I think that's like a really beautiful way of thinking about politics, right? Is that we can act more efficiently the greater and more expansive our knowledge is, right? But that doesn't mean that knowledge has to then, you know, and some of it has to be left aside, or we have to like not be concerned about those aspects of our reality, and instead focus on that thing that's going to have the greatest impact, and think really hard about it and engage it really intensely, right? And coming from a perspective of, you know, I understand, I can zoom out, I can see like in the language, right? I can see the global, right? I can see the way that these are global relations, right? But I'm not gonna, I understand that, I get those arguments. Neoliberalism, I understand those arguments, but I'm gonna focus on this particular thing. I think that's kind of what I'm doing in the Koch book, right? Is like, you know, it's not an argument about the neoliberalization of the university, right? But is instead kind of taking that argument and saying, this is one particular place that we can push on that big, broader theoretical argument and push on it really hard. And I think if you push on it hard enough, then you are able to do stuff with that argument.
Great. Well, this is a perfect segue to kind of asking you, you know, the question, which is, what should we be focusing on now? You know, a lot of your writing and engagement results from your work with the AAUP, as well as with the group Faculty First Responders, two organizations that are devoted to fighting adjunctification, flows of dark money, the repression of academic freedom on campuses today. So as someone working and struggling on college campuses at present, what would you say are the major struggles facing people working in higher education? Where should we be focused?
What should be done, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously the hard question, but I would say, you know, get involved. I mean, this is just kind of when we started that AAUP chapter at Trinity, 2017, had no idea that the campus reform would attack our colleague Johnny Williams. But because we had created that chapter, was able to meet a bunch of people in the AAUP. The AAUP was incredibly helpful in kind of shaping and helping us think through a response, providing us with powerful language, calling the administration and telling them that they were sending an investigative team to campus to examine their handling of the campus reform attack, right? And so it was just that simple not simple, but that process of setting up a chapter and being prepared and being organized in a preliminary way, that when that attack happened, it made it possible to respond in ways that really like transformed my intellectual career, right? Because after that attack, I got more involved in the AAUP. I met Ralph Wilson through the AAUP. We started working on right-wing attacks on higher education. I began researching that. We published a book, and in that way, I think that kind of that broad sense of like the university is also, to the degree that we value the university, either as it is or as we imagine it should be, right? That's something that we can no longer assume will just be there, right? It's actually something that we have to fight for and we have to defend it, right? That idea of, having time and to teach students with what we believe students should teach should learn, as opposed to what the legislature thinks that students should learn, to be able to have time for research, to have time, and resources and opportunities to engage in intellectual work. And, that we can't just assume that, that's how, that's something that exists. That's actually, a pretty, that itself, that our vision of what the university is, that is being kind of neoliberalized, is itself a university that was the product of struggle, right? So the universities have historically been exceptionally elitist, exceptionally male, exceptionally white, built on reproducing privilege, wealth, and only after massive protests and massive mobilization and political demands did the universities engage in things like massification and the expansion and the ability for students from all backgrounds to attend university. And then that kind of mid-20th century American university becomes taken up as the model of what a university is, right? When in fact that's a kind of an epiphenomenal moment. And right now what we're seeing is, Reagan and the Kochs and the right-wing counter-revolution understood that period as a fundamental transformative, a period of time where that particular university form had ramifications, had profound effects. Not all good, of course, but like had profound effects, transformed all aspects of society, scared the crap out of the libertarians, and then they want to fight back against it. So like I think that for us, it's incumbent that we really be clear about what we want a university to be, and not be afraid to like dream big, right? And to think about what a university can be very clear-eyed about what a university is, not hold on to these romantic narratives about the great public university, blah, 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 but be very clear about what universities have always been, but also not so cynical that we think of them just as the reproduction of capital. Because I think that, universities contain their own dense levels of contradiction, right? And so that question of how can we inhabit these particular institutions, in the same way that if, I worked at a Trader Joe's or Starbucks right now, I would be thinking, how do I unionize my workforce here? Like, this is a particular place where I could, make a change on the world, intervene in this particular conjuncture, use my skills in order to push, and to try to achieve a political outcome that I see as being a part of making the world a better place. A similar kind of question needs to be asked about higher education, right? Like, what is the vision of the university that we want, and what are the threats to that, and how are we going to engage as best as we can and to the best of our abilities, and kind of making that possible world more possible.
It's a heck of a time to be in higher education, and I'm really grateful to be in the trenches with you, Isaac. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to discuss?
Oh, man.
In 5 minutes or less.
5 minutes or less. This is part of the job interview where they always say you should have an answer to, you should have a question to ask you, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I think too, like the thing I'm working on now that I'm really interested in, maybe it's just because it's what I'm working on now, but I do think that it's really this interesting period of time kind of thinking about the AAUP and the broader argument about the university that comes from a very liberal understanding of the university, right? And so the history of the AAUP being a professional organization created around the same time as the American Medical Association, American Bar Association, and very much in that model of being like, we are a different kind of worker, we are not working class, we're professionals, right? And that notion of professionalism then being tied into a lot of our understandings of academic freedom, and the kinds of protections, the tenure system and things like that. And as the university gets attacked and gets deprofessionalized, that puts a lot of the pressure on, it makes us more vulnerable to right-wing attacks, it makes us more vulnerable to precarity and everything that comes with that. And so there's that kind of tension between the call for reprofessionalization, right? And also that critique of professionalism and what kind of foundation, if not professionalism, can we reconceptualize a university on, right? So I'm deeply influenced by my friend Eli Meyerhoff's brilliant book, Beyond Education, where he thinks about modes of study and kind of thinking about kind of how to think about universities as sites of possible multiple modes of study, as opposed to a site for receiving an education, right? And I think that question of, what is the foundation for, a professoriate and a student population and a university that doesn't hinge on kind of now 100-year-old plus understandings of professionalism, expertise, right? Where tenure is a limited thing, where sabbaticals are a limited thing, right? Like what would it mean to imagine a future where universal sabbaticals, universal tenure, right?
I'll take that. Oh, right.
But to rethink those founding assumptions around higher education is something that I think is really difficult to do from within the institution, and also I think really important for helping us to get outside of the limitations that get imposed by resource scarcity and the kind of narrowing of imaginaries that happened when we're like only in survival mode, right? We need to survive, but we also need to imagine a bigger than mere survival. And I think that's kind of the next step for us in higher education.
Well, Isaac Kamola, thank you for your work, thank you for your imagining, and thank you for being on Conjuncture. It's been great.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And thanks to all our listeners and viewers for tuning in. Stay tuned.